I was recently watching a YouTube video about schizophrenics, and I noticed this, what should I say, this commonality between me and them. So these people that hear voices are hearing the Sams. That was them just then. When they put healing in my voice, when I said that impulse that they gave to me, translated it or transmitted. See how I just did it again? And that's the Sams. And so the Sams are real, and there are real voices, and they do exist. And that isn't crazy to know that. It's paying attention just enough to the rest of the world and one's own thoughts to realize that everything is reflective. And so they'll say, well, it feels like people are talking behind my back. And I know what they're saying is because there's a commentary, there's this constant running commentary. And it's kind of like there's a phone, and I'm used to hearing just my own voice back to myself. That's how it was before my psychosis. And I call that view submodality, because what it is it's not a recognition of the separation between oneself and oneself. It's like I view myself as a discrete, concrete, contiguous, continuous, unchanging identity. And I view the world also in that same way. And this is sort of like believing that the world is flat. If you just glanced at it for a moment, that's how it would seem. But then you start to pay attention to synchronicity or synchronistic events. And you start to notice Freudian slips, and you start to notice subliminal patterns, and you start to notice the subconscious in the consciousness. The consciousness becomes aware directly of the subconsciousness that is, the undertow or the current that's directed towards something. And usually it's towards something bad, which is why most of the time when we're presented with that information, it's scary, because the id wants a lot of really horrible shit. And that's our soul. And our souls are very sick. And they're sick because they don't have enough faith in something, usually other people, sometimes themselves, in order to establish a secure relationship with another human being, which just flows naturally. If you allow it to, it will just flow naturally. And this is said both in a karmic way of letting things flow, because you, by obstructing someone else's flow, obstruct your own. You turn into a solid crystalline object, but you're in a river of flowing dynamism. So you're not going to last. It will erode you. And the same can be said on the other side with Christianity or the Western view, which is you're not accepting God's grace. You're either judging yourself as unworthy or you're judging someone else as unworthy. And we can't make those judgments of worth because we don't have anything other than our own selves to compare to. And then maybe you could say, well, we have God to compare to, but we can't encapsulate God. We don't know the value of God. Well, we can say we know what we don't know. We are inferring. We're pointing at the moon. We're not touching it. So we don't know what the value of God is in order to relate and draw that absolute value distinction or difference, or measure the difference between ourselves and God. So we don't know if we're actually better or worse or identical. We could infer, and our religion tells us as such, but we don't know. It's not something that we can grasp in our hand and have all of our fingers all the way around it so that we have total control over it. It's like that Quidditch ball, that weird little ball that just like randomly flits about, and you cannot hold on to it. It will just keep going and going and flitting around all over the place. And if you try to grab it, it will just keep doing that, and it will shake you off of it because it can't be moved, even though it's, small enough that it looks like you can grab it. Even if you were to, it would wrench itself free from your grasp. So there is no way to grab onto that. And my soul, like all souls, is a grabber. That's what it wants to do, is grab onto something. Oh my God, I finally found that fucking shoreline. I finally found that solid rock that I can put all of my faith into and invest everything in, and I can just like attach like a barnacle to this rock. But the rock isn't a rock, it's a ship. And the ship has crew people, and they scrape you off of the ship back into the sea from whence you came, etc. So there really isn't a way of grabbing anything and then still succeeding, because the failure is in the grabbing. The missing is in the grabbing, because you don't even need to grab it. It's like a butterfly. It's like you don't need to catch it. You just let it float around, let it just gently float about. And then it lets you do the same thing. And so you learn, either through karmic reflection, of beating yourself into a pulp, and yourself being the Atman, the higher self, beating the lower self, the ego, into submission. Or, which is, it takes discipline to devote oneself to the real betterment of oneself at the cost of the present to gain in the long term future. And it's the same lesson across all, schools of thought there. And it on and on and on. So I have realized that the theory that I've been working on is the phone. It's the phone through which the voices speak. Now, this is extremely dangerous information, because if I learn how the phone works, then I can dial the wrong number. I can prank call my neighbors. I can call someone up and tell them that I'm in some kind of an emergency when I'm not. I can manipulate things. I can misread things. I can, exponentially cause error by introducing random error into this otherwise perfect machine. But I'm not a machine. I have not yet melded with the phone. But there's a thing in the theory where you've got fractal assimilation, where you've got fractal self-similarity above and below, like zooming in and out. I guess that would be forward and backward, in and out, whatever. But along an axis, there's a fractal pattern that gets replicated. And you can do it, and that's the crystalline formation that I always talk about. The crystal, that's what it is. The crystal is a lattice structure or fractal pattern that is replicated across an entire axis. But the weird thing is, it's kind of like trying to fit a sphere onto a Cartesian plane. I guess I could take the Cartesian plane and wrap it around the sphere. But the problem with that is, while it doesn't change the topology locally, it does change the topology globally. And because of introducing that curvature into an otherwise infinitely flat plane, it distorts it. And you'll notice when you try to mentally represent that, you take a blanket that has a grid line pattern on it, and all of those grids you can see are equidistant from each other. They're not closer or further away. When you put them around the sphere, then you notice that you either have to rip the blanket on its sides so that the tops touch, because it's in a square shape, and it won't fit all the way around it, so you'll have to rip it open and rearrange it. It takes all kinds of cuts and tears and stretches and reattachments in order to make that flat plane fit on a curved sphere. It doesn't leave the grid lines in the same equidistant position that they once were in. And so there's not going to be enough information just by learning what the grid lines pattern is, as if they were flat, that would ever tell me what the curvature is like. I can tell what the curvature is like only if I were to look at the totality. But from a local standpoint, I can't tell the difference. No matter how far I seem to go, I can only ever observe whatever it's in my immediate vicinity. If I want to try to observe something that's beyond my sight, my line of sight, then I have to predict it by using theoretical knowledge, and then I don't really see what's happening somewhere else. I predict, or I theorize that something is going on over there. But I don't see it. So it's the case that the person that is on the other line is so totally independent from myself that I have learned that it is not myself. And I've learned that it is not nothing because of my quote-unquote psychosis, which reminds me. So all forms of psychosis or insanity are all error, actually, in judgment in general, is an error of misplacement. It's treating an object as if it were a subject. It's treating a subject as if it were an object or a relation. It's treating an idea as if it were a physical manifestation, something like that. There's a mismatch where the relations might be logical or internally valid locally, but there's no way to extend that view that they have globally. There would be no way to replicate it across multiple people. So this massive deviation between the individual and every other individual that they share their space and time with is so vast and so insurmountable that it is not possible that any other person shared the exact same view that they have and still occupy the same surrounding adjacent space and time that they do. In other words, the only person that could believe the crazy things that crazy people believe exist in some other universe somewhere, or some abstract hypothetical world that never manifested, or some impossible future that never comes to pass. It's something like that. It's so far removed from local causality that it really it matters in a global sense, but it doesn't matter locally. Locally, it just gets passed over. Because what do you do with it? It's not. You can't replicate it. It's like a scientific hypothesis or study or whatever that was so botched that no one else can follow the steps to replicate the process to come to the same conclusions. So while no one ever reaches another conclusion, no one ever replicates the test. So it's like this one scientist screaming in a room that, X is Y. And everyone else in the room is like, yeah, except we can't, we can't conduct the process that you used to ascertain the equality between X and Y. So we'll never be able to conclude our study, so then we don't ever get the data, so then we can't ever make our own conclusion. The only data that we can ever receive is only indirect from them, the person that did the experiment originally, which is, that's what it is to be crazy, is to be the only scientist in the room that ever did such and such experiment. And no other scientist in the room has ever, or will ever, or could ever replicate that experiment, let alone find the same conclusion. So then the conclusion becomes unfalsifiable, because only that one person can do that study or that experiment. And usually the reason is because it's either something that's endemic to that person themselves, which is paranoid psychosis and paranoid delusions of persecution, usually, because the person is looking at themselves and they're finding faults. And then that's being projected into their worldview. And so they see faults coming at them, directed at them, from every corner, from every disjointed, broken object on the ground. The wind blowing is whispering it in their ear. Everything around them, the sun shining, is shining rays of antagonism against them. I mean, everything warps and bends to that, because again, it can't be replicated. No one else occupies that world. That world has been shrunken to fit this one person. So everything else in the world starts getting absorbed and eaten by that person's delusion that they won't let go of. And the longer that goes on, either the more mass gets accumulated in it, like a black hole eating everything around it, or it radiates away, like Hawking radiation, evaporating the black hole into just normal space. And the person withdraws and eventually becomes indiscernible from, spending time and space in a room with them is equivalent to and indiscernible from them not being there. And they've just, shrunken into themselves until there's nothing there. And one of those two things happens, and it's an impossible, unsustainable worldview. And it, like I said, usually involves some kind of a magical thing that's endemic to the person themselves. Like, everybody is following me and me alone and no one else. They're not following anyone else. And whatever's happening to me is not happening to anyone else. This is just something that has only ever happened to me. Well, if that's true, then whatever that world is literally alien from everyone else's, because no one can or will ever feel like that or know what that is or reach that conclusion. Then we can't follow you. So then what kind of causal impact can you have if no one else can follow you? And so that's just the end result of it. So the psychosis is not in the hearing of the voices. The psychosis is in telling other people about them. Everybody hears voices. But everybody hears voices except very rare exceptions like Tucker Carlson and some other people that I've noticed where they're Aboriginal, OTEP, where they're Aboriginals, and they're not aware yet of the SAMs, where they're not aware of the voices, and they literally don't hear them. It's like my pre-psychosis consciousness, where I thought that I was one discrete entity and the world was one discrete entity and made up of, smaller discrete entities, all of which occupy their location, and I occupy mine. And there's no, what would you say? There's no synchronicity. Everything is just causally and totally independent. So the world is operating totally independently from myself, and I am operating totally dependent upon the world, usually. And in some cases, the reverse, where I'm totally independent causally. So then I don't have any traction, because anything that I attempt to cause in the world gets severed through the lack of causal connection, because of how special or unique my situation is from everyone else's. So then nobody gets it, nobody listens, nobody understands, and blah, blah, blah. So the psychosis is not in the hearing of the voices. The voices are synchronistic events and Freudian slips of the tongue, and things like that, that you'll hear someone else speaking that is independent from yourself, because it's not some impulse that is derived from within and then spills outward, at least according to your own awareness when you're having a psychosis. It's that the world, it's like hydroplaning. You don't get any traction on the road, you're slipping. The wheels are spinning like mad, but their car is not moving. It's not responding to the spinning of the wheel. The spinning of the wheel does not make any difference to the car or the way that it's oriented. It does not grab anything. It doesn't touch anything. It's just spinning. The RPMs are increasing, but the miles per hour are not. Or the train left the station, but the train left, but it never quite reached the station. There's all kinds of silly little ways of saying it, but it's the same problem. Now, the difference is that most people will recognize that slip, and then they'll pump the brakes. They'll stop trying to brake, or they'll stop trying to accelerate, one of the two. And they'll pump it. They'll do some kind of oscillation to regain the traction. But the worst thing that you can do is to keep braking. And I've learned this by driving in the snow, for example. You can't just hold the brakes like you do in warmer climates. You have to pump the brakes because of the irregularity it causes it to grab the snow. But if you're just holding the brakes, then it will ski over the snow, because the snow will build up in the threads of the tire and fill in all the gaps, and then it just becomes a smooth surface on another smooth surface, and then it slips. So you have to pump the brakes, and that stops the threads from accumulating the snow. It kind of knocks it off there, causes some kind of irregularity, and then it can grab the snow again, and you get traction back. But the psychosis is not in the hearing of the voices. It's not in the awareness of synchronistic events. It's not in the awareness of Freudian slips. It's not in the awareness that someone else is causing those, not the person themselves that does the Freudian slip. They don't do that. That just happens, and it happens independently of that person. And it's very obvious. When you look at it, you can see it. It's obvious that the person that has the synchronicity happen to them is just that. It's somebody that is happening. It is somebody that has something happening to them. And they have to kind of push through that if they want their own voice heard, and etc. And most people, our willpower is never going to be the same level to overcome that, because it's like pushing back the ocean. Yeah, you've got your hands, and yeah, you can push water, but you can't push back the ocean. You can't hold it back from the tides. You can't just stop it from happening. And so the psychosis is in thinking that all of that synchronicity, all of those Freudian slips that other people experience are somehow erroneously, but they don't know that. The psychosis is in not recognizing the error in doing this, that the other people that have those Freudian slips are actually conscious of saying those Freudian slips, which they aren't, because that's how they slipped, or that those slips are all being directed at only them and not to the person who made the slip and not to the person that they're directly talking to, but some bystander that happens to eavesdrop on their conversation and hear it. And that's insane, because what that does is it places the person that eavesdropped and thought that they were talking about them, and it places them at the center of everything, and says, no, all these relations only apply to this one person, rather than the truth, which is that those relations belong to everyone. So yes, it is saying something about that person, but it's also saying something about someone else. And it's also saying something that no one else heard, that no one heard, that, just got unnoticed or whatever. But the relation still exists. It just wasn't made aware of to all people at that time in that place. So the psychosis is in thinking that there is such a thing as an absolute center that is somehow also not the midpoint between the origin and the terminus. And that's a patent error. It's a self-contradictory, irresolvable error. It's an error between the definition of a thing and the application of that definition to itself, where it doesn't even match its own description. It says something that can't be true even if we assume it to be true. It just kicks its own ass. It doesn't, it kills itself off. It screams itself into silence. I don't know, it eats its own head. It's just impossible. It doesn't work. To think that all the mathematical relations, which during the psychosis, they do recognize those. The problem is that they all warp around that one person that is having the psychosis. The psychosis is in believing that oneself is the center of all these relations and all these synchronicities and all these coincidences somehow are all bent and pointing to them and not to anyone else. And it's like, hey, don't you think that other people would notice? And then weirdly, it's like there's just another excuse for it. It's, oh, well, all those people are asleep. They aren't awake yet. All those people are stupid, or they're crazy, or they're evil, or there's just something wrong with them, or this is all a dream and it's a simulation, and that's how you can tell it's a simulation. It doesn't really make sense. Well, why? Because it's just a simulation, and that's an unfalsifiable claim. There's no way to prove that this is real. There's no way to prove to someone that there's a person inside of me if you aren't me. And so then the psychosis continues and continues and continues, because the person never gets confronted with the proof or disproof of what they believe. They can never find proof, and they can never be disproven. And if they're made aware of that, that alone won't convince them, because they'll just say, see, it goes right along with it, because, in my case, it was, well, no one else can know, because if I told them that this was all a simulation, that they were just dream characters inside my own head, because I was experiencing solipsistic views as well, because the synchronicity was so overwhelming me that the only thing I could deal with, the only thing that I could see, was the synchronistic coincidences and relations that I would see for myself. And that alone was too much to bear. So I wasn't able to juggle all that and then deal with other people's also, and notice that they are also juggling with this and having to deal with it themselves. So the psychosis is not in the hearing of the voices. It's in thinking that all the voices are only talking to that one person instead of talking to everyone simultaneously. The voices exist, but they're talking to everyone simultaneously, not just one person. As soon as you realize that, as soon as you realize that the voices are speaking simultaneously to all people, not just the people that hear it, but even people who don't hear it, and it still applies, because it's just reflecting relativity. It's just reflecting the entire field of relativity. And this is what I call God's mind. And what it is it's a collection of all deductive logical reasoning. And that's fine. That's a mirror, and it will reflect perfectly. But the problem with it is, where is that mirror oriented? Now, if that mirror, because you only have one, so is that mirror oriented toward me or toward you or toward God or toward the world or toward this tree or whatever the fuck it is that I'm focusing on? And that's the psychosis, is not being able to figure out where is this mirror pointing. And so the field of relativity, which is a mirror, or as I've been calling it, a phone, is not enough to be able to explain everything. There has to be someone talking on the phone. There has to be someone using the phone. There has to be someone listening to that phone or someone else on the phone. And there has to be a reason for the phone to exist, etc. There are other things on the table that we can be aware of here that are finite. They're not relative, but they are finite. And they're subjective, artistic, religious, meaningful, whatever. And objective, physical, undeniable, real, whatever you want to call it. The relativistic mirror is neither of those. And that's what makes it look like it's supernatural. Because it's not a subject and it's not an object. And so we tend to think that it's God. But the phone is not God. The phone is just all the collections. It's the collection of all ideas, all logic, all deductive reasoning, all internal validation, where parts all fit like puzzle pieces in a puzzle. All of them fit, and it makes the puzzle whole. And that process of putting all the puzzle pieces together is relativistic. It's the process of the field of relativity, I guess you would say, calculating or processing all of the infinite positions that are held within it. And the funny thing about infinity is that while there are different sizes of infinity, infinity is sort of like a species. And you know how like one species can't mate with another species? And the product of the mating of those is nothing. There is no product. So you can't take infinity and multiply it by a number that isn't infinity. But theoretically, you could take infinity and multiply it by itself. And what happens if you do that is you'll get scales of fractal worlds or modal worlds, worlds in which some thing is true and it's not true for any of the other worlds. And yet all those worlds have the same thing in common, or something in common. Not that specific thing that makes them all distinct from each other, of course, but something that all of them hold as universal between them. And that's what makes it a world. And that's, again, how relations happen between the parts, is that they all relate kind of like an axis, where there's one point on one end of the axis and there's another point on the other end of the axis. And relativity is the process in between that translates what the difference is between one point in reference to the other one. So it's the thing that's on the other end, and it's this far or close away, whatever. All of that in the field of relativity is limited to relativity. And relativity is defined by having two referent points, two things that are independent of each other, both of which in conjunction yield the product of a relativistic conclusion, a logically valid conclusion. And usually it's in the form of a hypothetical syllogism, which is composed of premises and conclusions. So you've got at least one premise and a correspondent, logically valid, necessarily true conclusion if the premise is also true. And here's where the madness sets in. Technically speaking, the statement, the hypothetical syllogism in which unicorns are being considered, which are an unempirically either unobservable or at least unobserved phenomenon, depending on if they're magical or not. If we assume that to be true, even though there's no empirical evidence that they exist, and even though there's no subjective connection to it that we have, then any conclusion that we draw about unicorns, while logically valid, still rests upon the assumption, the smuggled-in assumption, that unicorns are real, that they actually exist. But it doesn't tell us, just simply by validating the syllogism, whether or not there are unicorns. It just validates the position that if they are real, then such and such, whatever, they are really fast, or they are really cool, or whatever conclusion that you want to draw from the premise that they have such an attribute, or that they have a necessarily implied attribute, or that they have a necessarily resultant empirical phenomenon manifest because of some genetic digital code or whatever that's in them. So, in other words, I can posit that there is some gene that does some phenomenologically, empirically observable thing, but until or unless somebody actually finds and isolates that gene and then corresponds it with that function, until that happens, then all of it is conjecture. It might make internal sense to me, but it won't have any traction in the world until or unless that data emerges. So that is what happens with psychosis. It's also what happens when we just make a simple mistake. The difference between a madness and a simple mistake is letting go of it. If you can let go of the mistake, or better yet, learn from it, then you won't go crazy. You'll just have a problem, but you won't go crazy. Now, if you focus on that problem and then you treat it as if it's the solution, where you're totally, it literally becomes unthinkable that whatever that wrong thing that you think is true is I forgot where I was going with that. If the thing that you think that is true, but is in actuality false, were presented to you, could you accept that you're at fault, that you made some mistake, and then change that or not? If you're not, then you're either crazy or you're stupid or you're evil. So if you're crazy, you'll double down on it and say, no, it really is real. And you'll just argue with me about what is real. If you're stupid, you'll just let it go because you don't want to solve it anyway and you don't care. If you're evil, then you'll... what's the third way of not dealing with that? You'll double down on the effect of making the other person think that that's real, even though you know it isn't. So it's sort of like being crazy and stupid simultaneously. It's like, I recognize that this isn't true, so I'm not crazy, but I'm going to make you believe that it is true because I'm evil. And so if I know that something is false, but then I present it to someone else with the intent that they believe that it's true, even though I don't, then that's evil. If I instead have it happen the other way, where I believe something is true even though it isn't actually true, then I become crazy. But if I make someone else believe a falsehood, then I'm evil. If I believe a falsehood, then I'm crazy. And if I don't care whether it's true or false, then I'm just stupid. And so those are the three ailments that happen to people, according to what I can see.